Hello, I'm Brandon Gerardi, and I'm currently doing my vlog on An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. So I'm going to begin with the summary. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is set during the Civil War, and it's split into three sections. So the first one uh, opens up in an ominous setting with a man on a railroad bridge, that bridge being Owl Creek Bridge from the title of the story, which is in Alabama, and it is 20 feet above a body of water, most likely Owl Creek. Um, so the man's hands are tied behind his back, and he has a rope tied around his neck. And the only other people on the bridge are a few members of the Union Army. The soldiers are preparing to execute the man, and he's just thinking about his whole life because he's about to be executed, and he's kind of getting freaked out by everything, every noise he hears, even his own stopwatch as it ticks. Is the noises are just freaking him out because he's about to die and doesn't know exactly what to think about his family and his whole life. So the captain places a plank under the man and commands the sergeant to stand on the other side of it to hold his weight. And then eventually the captain gives the sergeant the signal to step off of the plank, and the plank falls, and then section two begins. So section two introduces three new characters. The first one being Peyton Farquhar, which is he's a slave owner from Alabama. The second character being a Confederate soldier who's looking for water, and the third being Mr. Farquhar's wife. So the soldier approaches the Farquhar residence and asks for water. And while Mrs. Farquhar goes to get the water, the soldier and Mr. Farquhar get into a conversation. So Mr. Farquhar, being from the South, obviously is very much for the Confederacy and all the beliefs of the South. And although he's not a soldier, he claims to be able to, well, not be able to, but want to do anything he can for the Confederacy. So he starts the conversation by asking the soldier about the war itself and how, like, the progress of the Civil War. And the soldier basically tells him that the North has conquered Owl Creek Bridge, and that they're fixing it up and using it. And so Mr. Farquhar asks what he, as a civilian, could do to maybe mess up the bridge or help out the army, just being a civilian. And he warns him by saying that if he does anything and gets caught, that he could be executed and most likely will be, and that the only thing he knows is that it's very flammable. So that's when Mrs. Farquhar returns, and the soldier gets his water, thanks them, and leaves. And later on, the audience is made aware that that soldier was not a Confederate soldier and was in fact a spy from the North. Which brings us into part three, section three of An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which returns us back to section one where the man was being hung. But what we find out is that that man is in fact Mr. Farquhar from part two, and he did in fact try to light the bridge on fire, was caught, and is now being executed. The plank has already been pulled, and as he's falling, the rope around his neck tied to the surface above him, the rope tore, so he has fallen into the body of water below him, and he's lost all consciousness because he hasn't been able to breathe for a while. So Mr. Farquhar gained some consciousness back from falling into the water, and notices that out of instinct his hands are going to tear off the ropes that are constraining them, and he successfully does that, which allows him to take the noose off of his neck. And he's trying to be as quiet as possible to avoid being shot at by the Confederate soldiers, but obviously he's trying to escape, so he's trying to get out of that water quick because he thinks at least he knows where his family is. So Obviously, they see him, they start shooting at him. He gets lucky, doesn't get hit, gets out of the water. They're shooting cannons at him, everything they can to make sure they get him after he tried to burn down the bridge. And he gets away and actually gets all the way. After hours of like staying up the whole night, he finds his wife in his house. And as soon as he gets there, he's returned to darkness and silence, as all of that section 3 was actually just the seconds before he actually died. The rope never broke. Plot twist. Yeah, I didn't like the ending very much either, but plot twist, he died and didn't the rope never broke. So I'll explain that a little bit more when we get to the one-word summary, but now I'm going to go into the context of the story. So Ambrose Gwinnett Bryce, he was born in 1842 and is known for his short stories, which are usually notably based on death or horror. And Bierce enlisted into the Indiana Volunteers 9th Army in 1861 and eventually fought in many of the battles of the Civil War. And Bierce spent almost the rest of his life after the war writing short stories, which showed some of his experiences in the war and kind of added lessons to those stories when he wrote them. And he devoted his entire life to this. He actually divorced his wife and lost his kids because he was so focused on writing. And to this day, this is kind of extra detail, but his death is still a mystery because he flew to Mexico. But anyways, so the story takes place obviously during the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, and as we know, Civil War is not a very nice time during American history. There's many sectional differences between the North and the South, and it's just not very pretty. So the reason why regionalism came as a part of American literature history is because with the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution, people thought that the traditions and beliefs of the time of the Civil War in both the South and the North were going to be lost through war and the industrialization in the Industrial Revolution. So Bierce and many other authors started writing these short stories to preserve the local colors, to say, of a specific region or time period of the Civil War, which is local colors is another term for the regionalism era of American literature and its history, because you're showing the local true colors of the situation and kind of preserving them through these stories. So now we're moving on to the one-word analysis, and the word I chose is apprehension, because the whole story is basically one big apprehensive mess, because as stated earlier, obviously, Section 2 is a flashback and Section 3 is completely made up and didn't happen to Mr. Farquhar. So throughout the story, Mr. Farquhar has many thoughts going through his head, and he doesn't want to think about the reality that is his inevitable death. And the entire plot is basically blinding the audience from what's actually happening, which is thought to be hours of searching for his wife, but is actually just seconds before he suffocates and dies. So my first expert is Dr. Lawrence L. Berkov, who is an expert professor of humanities at the University of Michigan, and is internationally known for being an expert on Ambrose Bierce. So Berkov states the most dramatic part of the story arises out of the hallucinations that occur in the unconscious mind of the man who is being hanged, a man who quotes, was as one already dead. This comes from Berkov's The Heart Has Its Reasons, Bierce's Successful Failure at Philosophy, that he wrote in 2002. And basically what he's saying is that the man's life is thought to live on for hours, as I explained earlier, but it's truly only the seconds before he's actually dead after the rope suffocates him. And although it's not the ending that people wanted, it's the inevitable one. And you can't really get away from it as apprehensive as you might be. So coincidentally, another piece that helped me come to the conclusion of apprehension being a good one-word summary is also by Dr. Berkov, and it's called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, Nothing Better Exists, where Berkov basically states that the story's theme is the failure to use, quote, this failure to use reason or the misuse of it will hasten death or bring it on needlessly. And basically what I thought Berkov was trying to say here is that everything you do in life either shortens the length of your life or keeps it exactly how it was. You can't make it longer by being apprehensive or questioning things. You're inevitably going to die at some point in your life, and either you shorten it or keep it as long as you can. You can't really make it longer. And this shows that the story delivers the idea that death is truly inevitable and your apprehension doesn't stop death. So my second expert on this is going to be Roy Morris Jr., who is also an expert on Ambrose Bierce and wrote a book called Ambrose Bierce, Alone in Bad Company. And however, I didn't use this because I used one that he wrote called So Many Needless Dead, The Civil War Witness of Ambrose Bierce, where Roy Morris Jr. explains if you read the story carefully enough, you'll understand that the ending isn't really a plot twist at all. And although it still kind of comes off as a plot twist, there's plenty of hints that it's just going to end with the death of Peyton Farquhar, because death is inevitable as much as the story made you suspenseful. It's just ended in death. So finally, the significance. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is very significant to the American literature canons as it represents a theme that is hard for many to grasp. There's a difference between reality and your imagination. Although the story is about the Civil War, Bierce allows the plot to be more focused on the actual occurrence of Owl Creek Bridge, which is the hanging of Bierce, or not hanging of Bierce, the hanging of Farquhar. And Bierce allows the plot, wrong sentence. With many sectional differences in the Civil War, Bierce doesn't let that get in the way of a story with a true theme, but also keeps, since the story is said to be a regionalism based on the era of regionalism, she keeps the attitudes and beliefs of the Civil War era of both the South and the North in perspective in her story. So my first expert on this is Clifford R. Ames, who wrote Do I Wake or Sleep? Techniques as Content in Ambrose Bierce's short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, where he says that, quote, the popularity of this short story is testimony to the author's technical skill in developing a storyline that seems to follow the logically consistent cause and effect pattern of conventional 19th century narration, while it abandons the single perspective and the single reality in favor of an ambiguous viewpoint that confuses the imaginary with the factual and substitutes physiological time for the regular incremental times of history. And basically what I thought Ames was saying here is that Bierce is able to hold a proper plot that is still interesting and suspenseful, but doesn't forget to keep the traditions and beliefs of the aims of the regionalism era to preserve that culture. And then my second expert here is Michael L. Hall, who discusses Bierce's ability to bring his experiences into his story, like An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and provides a true account of suspense for the audience to make the story more interesting, but also hold qualities of America during the Civil War era. And basically, the story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, obviously Bierce is adding in his own experiences from being in the Civil War, and really holds on to the ability to represent those beliefs without getting too caught up in the war, but also keeping the setting minimally including the Civil War because that's an important part of American history. So that's all for An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Thank you very much.